The cry beneath the burning sky. The sound that stopped Ethan Cole wasn't a gunshot or a scream. It was a child's sob cutting through the Montana heat like broken glass. He'd ridden past dying towns, burning homesteads, and more misery than any man should carry. He'd learned the hard way that stopping meant staying, and staying meant losing. But when 8-year-old Lily Warren's blistered fingers wrapped around his boot, and she whispered, "Please don't ride away. Mama's dying, and nobody will help us." Something in his chest cracked open like sun-scorched earth finally receiving rain. Welcome to a story about the moment one man stopped running from his past and rode straight into his future. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales of courage and redemption travel. Now, let me take you back to that blazing summer day in 1867 Montana Territory. The heat was a living thing that summer. It rose from the Montana earth in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon until reality itself seemed uncertain. Dust hung suspended in air, too thick to breathe, coating everything: sagebrush, stone, the weathered buildings of settlements clinging to existence by sheer stubbornness. The kind of heat that made men mean and cautious, that turned neighbors into strangers, that whispered lies about conservation and self-preservation until community became just a word people remembered from easier times. Ethan Cole had been riding through that heat for 3 days straight. His horse, a gray gelding named Ash, moved with the mechanical persistence of an animal too tired to protest. Ethan sat loose in the saddle, his body swaying with the rhythm of hoofbeats, his mind somewhere between memory and nothing. The tin star he'd worn for 7 years sat wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his saddlebag, buried beneath spare ammunition and hardtack. He hadn't looked at it in 6 months, didn't plan to look at it ever again. The trail wound through scrub pine and rocky outcroppings, following a creek bed that had run dry weeks ago. Ahead, the settlement of Redemption Springs sprawled like a collection of broken promises: false-fronted buildings, a church steeple listing slightly to the left, corrals holding livestock too heat-stupid to move. Ethan had no intention of stopping. He'd passed through 100 towns just like it, and they all told the same story: good intentions buried under hard reality, hope deferred until it withered into resignation. He was maybe a quarter mile from the edge of town when he heard it. A sound so small he almost missed it beneath the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of Ash's hooves. A sob. Raw and desperate, the kind that came from a throat already scraped clean by crying. Ethan's hand moved automatically to the Colt at his hip before his conscious mind caught up. Not danger, grief, the most common sound in the territories, and the one he'd learned to ignore. He kept riding. "Please." The word barely carried across the distance, thin as spider silk. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd made himself a promise after Virginia City, after he'd stopped to help and ended up losing everything that mattered. No more stops, no more getting involved, just movement, constant and purposeful, carrying him away from the wreckage of who he'd been. "Please don't ride away." Ash slowed without command, ears swiveling back toward the sound. Ethan cursed under his breath, but his hands were already pulling the reins, turning the horse toward a narrow path leading off the main trail. Through the heat shimmer, he could make out a small figure, a child standing in the middle of the path like a fence post, barefoot and motionless. As he drew closer, details emerged. A girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a faded calico dress 2 sizes too large. Dark hair stuck to her forehead and neck in sweat-dampened tangles. Her feet were red and blistered, the skin peeling where gravel had burned through. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely, gray as winter storm clouds, filled with a desperation far too old for her face. She didn't move as Ash approached, just stood there, swaying slightly, her small chest heaving with each breath. Ethan pulled up 10 feet away, keeping distance between himself and whatever catastrophe she represented. "You lost." His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by dust and disuse. The girl shook her head. "Mama's dying. I need help." 4 words. Simple and terrible. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach despite the oppressive heat. "Where's your pa?" "Dead. 6 months." No tears, just facts delivered in a voice too steady for a child. "Mama got the fever 3 days ago. Nobody will come. They're all afraid." Town's got a doctor. Doctor won't come without payment. We got nothing left. She took a step forward and Ethan saw her wince as gravel bit into raw flesh. Please, I've been to every house. They all said no, said sickness is catching, said Mama made her choices. But she didn't choose to get sick. She didn't choose for Papa to die. The logic was irrefutable and heartbreaking. Ethan looked past her toward the town, then back the way he'd come. Every instinct screamed at him to ride on. This wasn't his problem. This territory was full of dying women and desperate children. He couldn't save them all, couldn't save any of them, really. He'd learned that lesson written in blood and failure. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. But I can't help you. He gathered the reins, preparing to ride around her. The girl moved fast, faster than her blistered feet should have allowed. Her small hands locked around his boot with surprising strength, her face tilted up toward his. You can. I know you can. I watched you ride up. You sit like Papa did, like the law, like someone who helps people. Tears finally came, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Please, I don't know what else to do. Mama's all I got, and she's burning up, and I can't lose her too. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He saw himself in those gray eyes, saw the desperation he'd felt holding his own daughter while fever consumed her, begging a doctor who arrived too late and drunk besides, saw the helplessness that had hollowed him out and left him drifting. What's your name? He heard himself ask. Lily. Lily Warren. How far to your place? Hope flared in her expression, painful in its intensity. Half-mile. Just past the creek bend. Please, will you come? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight of consequence settling across his shoulders. This was a mistake. He knew it bone deep. But he also knew he couldn't ride away from those eyes, from that desperate grip on his boot, from the ghost of his own failure reflected in a child's tears. Let go, Lily. I'll follow you. She released his boot and started running before he'd finished speaking, moving back up the path despite the pain each step clearly caused. Ethan dismounted, leading Ash at a walk to match the girl's limping pace. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and somewhere in the distance a crow called, harsh and mocking. The Warren cabin sat in a shallow depression where scrub pine gave way to open ground. It was small, rough-built, the kind of structure men threw together when they were optimistic about the future and naive about the challenges ahead. The roof sagged in the middle. One shutter hung crooked. The vegetable garden beside the house had surrendered to the drought, leaving only withered stalks and cracked earth. But it was the silence that struck Ethan hardest. No chickens in the yard. No smoke from the chimney despite the need for boiling water. No neighbors checking in. No community rallying around one of their own. Just oppressive quiet broken only by the buzz of flies and Lily's labored breathing as she pushed open the door. Mama? I found someone. I found help. The interior was a single room divided by function rather than walls. A cook stove in one corner, cold. A rough table with 2 chairs. A bed against the far wall where a woman lay motionless beneath a thin quilt despite the suffocating heat. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. Margaret Warren looked like she was already halfway to the grave. Her face was flushed deep red, sweat soaking the pillow beneath her head. Dark hair clung to her forehead and neck in damp ropes. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her breathing shallow and rapid. She didn't respond to Lily's voice, didn't acknowledge their presence in any way. Ethan crossed to the bed in 3 strides, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him wince. This wasn't just fever. This was the kind of burning that cooked a person from the inside out. He'd seen it before, in army camps and mining towns. Sometimes people survived. More often, they didn't. When did she last drink? He asked, already rolling up his sleeves. Yesterday morning, I tried, but she couldn't swallow. Lily hovered at his elbow, her small hands twisting together. Is she going to die? The question deserved honesty. I don't know, but we've got work to do if she's going to have a chance. He turned to face the girl fully. You did good getting help, Lily. Now I need you to be strong a little longer. Can you do that? She nodded, straightening her thin shoulders. Good. First thing, we need cool water. Is the well still drawing? Yes, sir. Out back. Bring me 2 buckets, clean ones. As she turned to go, he added, and find any cloth you've got. Sheets, towels, anything we can use for cooling. Lily disappeared out the back door with purpose in her stride. Ethan turned his attention to Margaret, carefully pulling back the quilt. She wore a simple cotton nightdress soaked through with perspiration. Her skin burned to the touch, and when he lifted her hand, checking for responsiveness, there was none. Deep unconsciousness, the body's last defense against overwhelming heat. He worked quickly, cataloging what he saw. No obvious wounds, no signs of childbirth complications, no smell of infection beyond the sickroom staleness. Just fever, dehydration, and the body's systems beginning to shut down from the assault. If this was the fever that had been moving through the territories, the one that killed 3 in 10 and left survivors weak for months, she needed water, cooling, and time. The door banged open and Lily staggered in carrying a bucket that sloshed water across the floor. She set it down with a grunt, then immediately turned back for the second one. Ethan grabbed a tin cup from the table, filled it, and moved back to the bed. Margaret, can you hear me? He slipped his hand behind her neck, supporting her head, and brought the cup to her lips. You need to drink. Water dribbled from her mouth, running down her chin. He tried again, tilting her head slightly, letting just drops pass her lips. Her throat convulsed weakly, a reflex, nothing conscious. But it was something. Lily returned with the second bucket and an armload of fabric, worn sheets, dish towels, even what looked like a child's small quilt. This is all we got. It's perfect. Ethan soaked one of the sheets in the cool well water, wrung it out, then laid it across Margaret's forehead and neck. The effect was immediate. Her breathing eased slightly, some of the terrible tension leaving her body. We're going to cool her down slow. Too fast and we risk shocking her system. You understand? Yes, sir. Lily watched with intense focus, memorizing every movement. What's your mama's full name? Margaret Rose Warren. She was Margaret Rose Fletcher before she married Papa. Ethan filed the information away, continuing to work as he talked. And your papa? What happened to him? Logging accident up in the high country. Tree fell wrong. Lily's voice stayed steady, but her hands clenched in her skirt. They brought him back, but he was already gone. Mama tried to keep the claim going, but it's been hard. People in town, they weren't kind after. Why not? Said a woman had no business trying to work land alone. Said we should sell out and move to family back east. But Mama said this was our home, what Papa built for us. Said we weren't quitting. Pride and stubbornness? Ethan recognized both. He'd seen it break people as often as save them. Your mama's got courage. She's got me. Simple statement of fact. We got each other. They fell into a rhythm, Ethan changing the cooling cloths, forcing water drop by drop past Margaret's lips, while Lily refilled buckets and wrung out fabric with determined efficiency. The girl moved despite her blistered feet, never complaining, focused entirely on the task at hand. Watching her, Ethan felt something stir beneath the careful numbness he'd cultivated. Recognition, perhaps. Respect, certainly. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun tracked across the sky outside, visible through the open door in a brass-bright arc. Inside the cabin, temperature gradually dropped from unbearable to merely stifling. Margaret's color began to shift from alarming crimson to a less dangerous flush. Her breathing deepened, evened out. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. She's looking better, Lily whispered, hope making her voice shake. Don't count on anything yet. Ethan refreshed the cloth on Margaret's forehead. Fever like this comes in waves. She might improve, then crash again. We need to stay vigilant. How long? Could be hours, could be days. Lily absorbed this with a solemn nod. You'll stay? The question hung in the stale air between them. Ethan looked at the girl, at her red feet and desperate eyes, and the faith she'd somehow maintained despite the world teaching her otherwise. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself, about the trail leading away from this place, about the careful distance he'd built between himself and other people's pain. Yeah, he heard himself say. I'll stay. Relief transformed Lily's face, making her look young again instead of ancient. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. We've got work ahead. He stood, joints protesting from kneeling. Your mama needs medicine. Real medicine, not just cooling cloths. That means the doctor. But we don't have money. I do. The words came easier than expected. Not much, but enough for a house call. You know where the doctor lives? Dr. Peters, above the general store. Right. I need you to stay here with your mama. Keep the cloths cool and wet. If she wakes, try to get her to drink. Can you manage that? Lily nodded fiercely. Yes, sir. Good girl. Ethan grabbed his hat from where he dropped it earlier. I'll be back soon as I can. He stepped out into the brutal afternoon heat, blinking against the sudden brightness. Ash stood in the sparse shade of a cottonwood, tail swishing at flies. Ethan swung into the saddle, feeling the familiar ache in muscles pushed past comfortable limits. The ride back to town took 20 minutes, and with each passing moment, he questioned his sanity. This wasn't his fight. These weren't his people. He'd learned the hard way that heroes died young or lived long enough to watch everything they tried to protect crumble anyway. But Lily's face kept surfacing in his mind, those storm cloud eyes and blistered feet, and the kind of courage that came from having no choice but to be brave. Redemption Springs looked different approaching from the Warren place. Smaller, somehow. Meaner. The main street stretched dusty and nearly empty in the afternoon heat, most folks having the sense to stay indoors. Ethan guided Ash to the general store, a two-story structure that seemed to be leaning slightly, as if even buildings got tired in this heat. A wooden staircase on the outside led to the second floor. Ethan climbed slowly, his boots loud on the weathered planks. At the top, a door stood propped open, and through it he could see a sparse office, desk, examining table, cabinets of supplies. Doctor. Howard Peters sat behind the desk, reading a medical journal with the intense focus of a man trying to forget where he'd ended up. He was maybe 50, gray-haired and lean, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much suffering and stopped being surprised by it. He looked up as Ethan's shadow fell across the doorway. Help you? Margaret Warren. She's burning up with fever. Been down 3 days. The doctor's expression closed like a door slamming. I know about Margaret Warren. Her daughter's been here twice already. I explained the situation. I don't work on credit, and the Warrens have no means of payment. Ethan pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and dropped it on the desk with a solid clink. That's $8 in silver, enough for a house call and medicine. Peters picked up the pouch, weighing it. This your money? Does it matter? Might. If you're family, you've got cause to pay. If you're just passing through. The doctor shrugged. I've seen men throw money at problems that aren't theirs, then disappear when things get complicated. Margaret Warren's situation is complicated. How so? She's a widow trying to hold land that half the territory wants. Her husband died owing money to people who don't forgive debts. She's got no protection, no prospects, and now she's sick during the worst heat wave we've seen in 10 years. Peter set the pouch down but didn't push it back. You ride in planning to marry her, take on her debts, and her daughter, and her failing claim? The bluntness of the question should have been shocking. Instead, Ethan appreciated it. I'm planning to keep her from dying. What happens after that is her choice, not mine. Something shifted in the doctor's face. Not warmth exactly, but a thawing of professional coldness. Fair enough. Let me get my bag. They rode back in silence, Peters on an old bay mare that picked her way carefully over the rough trail. The doctor didn't ask questions, and Ethan didn't volunteer information. Two men on a mission that required no explanation beyond basic human decency, a concept that seemed rare enough these days to be notable. Lily met them at the cabin door, her face tight with worry. She's worse. Started shaking real bad about 10 minutes ago. Ethan and Peters moved inside as one. Margaret was indeed shaking, hard tremors that made the bed frame rattle, her body's desperate attempt to fight off the infection consuming her. The doctor crossed to her immediately, his movements practiced and efficient. How long since she last drank? Maybe 30 minutes, Ethan replied. She's not conscious. We've been forcing water drop by drop. Peters nodded, already examining Margaret, checking her pulse, peeling back her eyelids, pressing fingers to her neck and jaw. Fever's high, but not critical yet. The shaking is actually good. Means her body's still fighting. He opened his bag, pulling out a brown bottle. Willow bark tincture. We need to get this in her. 2 teaspoons every 4 hours. She can't swallow, Lily said, her voice small. We'll work around that. Peters measured out the medicine carefully, mixing it with water to thin it. Lift her head. Support it firm. Ethan positioned himself on the bed, cradling Margaret's head against his shoulder while Peters worked the liquid past her lips with practiced patience. Most of it went down, enough to count. The doctor repeated the water process, coaxing her body to accept what it desperately needed. This the girl? Peters asked, nodding toward Lily. Lily Warren. She's the one who found me. The doctor's gaze sharpened, taking in Lily's blistered feet and exhausted face. Let me see those feet, child. Lily hesitated, but at Ethan's nod, she sat on the other chair and extended her legs. Peters examined them with gentle efficiency, his mouth tightening at what he saw. 2nd-degree burns in places. You walked far? All over town, then out to the main trail. Barefoot? Had to move fast, didn't have time for shoes. Peters didn't comment on the heartbreak of that statement, just cleaned and wrapped the feet with practiced care, applying salve that made Lily wince. Stay off these for at least 2 days. Longer if you can. But your mama needs you healthy. The doctor stood, packing his supplies. She's through the worst of it, I think. Keep her cool, keep forcing fluids, give her the tincture on schedule. In 3 days, if she's not improving, send for me again. He turned to Ethan. You staying? For now. Peter studied him with eyes that had evaluated countless men over countless years. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he simply nodded. Good. She'll need help for at least a week, probably longer, and when she's well enough to understand, he paused, choosing words carefully. Tell her Howard Peters came. Tell her some debts matter more than money. Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the doctor was gone, the sound of his horse fading into the evening quiet. Ethan and Lily stood in the dimming cabin, looking at each other across Margaret's still form. You really staying? Lily asked. Ethan looked at the woman in the bed, at the child with bandaged feet, at the rough cabin that represented someone's dream of home and security. He thought about the trail leading away from here, about the emptiness of constant movement, about the weight of choosing to care when caring meant risk. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm really staying. The night that followed was long and strange. Ethan and Lily worked in shifts, one sleeping while the other maintained the cooling routine and forced water past Margaret's lips every hour. The fever spiked twice more, sending Margaret into shaking fits that left both of them exhausted and frightened. But each time, the medicine and persistence pulled her back from the edge. Around midnight, Ethan sent Lily to bed despite her protests. The girl was asleep before her head hit the pillow, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Ethan sat beside Margaret's bed in the silence, listening to the night sounds filtering through the open door. Coyotes in the distance, wind in the pines, the creek that wasn't running anymore but still carried the memory of water in the shape of its stones. He studied Margaret's face in the lamplight. Even burning with fever, even unconscious and fighting for survival, there was something in her features that spoke of strength, a stubbornness in the set of her jaw, a determination in the lines around her eyes that suggested she'd laughed often before grief taught her the cost of joy. You've got a hell of a daughter, he said quietly, not expecting an answer. Walked herself raw looking for help, never quit, never gave up on you. That's your doing, I expect. Teaching her to be strong. He refreshed the cloth on her forehead, his movements gentle. So you need to fight through this, Margaret Warren, because that girl out there, she deserves better than losing both parents before she's 10 years old. The words hung in the still air, and Ethan felt the strange intimacy of the moment, speaking truth to an unconscious woman in a borrowed cabin while the Montana night pressed close. He'd built his life around distance, around the safety of never connecting deeply enough to be hurt again. But here he sat, hip deep in someone else's crisis, making promises to strangers that bound him as surely as any oath. Somewhere around 3 a.m, Margaret's fever broke. The change was subtle at first, a slight easing in her breathing, a lessening of the terrible heat radiating from her skin. Ethan noticed it immediately, sitting forward with sharp attention. He checked her pulse, finding it stronger and more regular, pressed his hand to her forehead, feeling the difference between killing heat and merely uncomfortable warmth. "That's it," he murmured. "Come back. Fight your way back." As if in response, Margaret's eyelids fluttered. Not opening, not yet, but movement. The first conscious response he'd seen. Ethan grabbed the water cup, ready, waiting. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, seeing without comprehending. "Easy," Ethan said softly. "You're safe. You're in your cabin. Your daughter's sleeping right over there." He waited for her gaze to track toward Lily's form on the small cot. "You've been sick, but you're past the worst of it. Right now, you need to drink." He supported her head, bringing the cup to her lips. This time she drank, really drank, her throat working consciously, her body recognizing what it needed. When she'd managed half the cup, Ethan eased her back down. "Lily," her voice was barely a whisper, rough from days of fever. "She's fine. Exhausted, but fine. She's the one who saved you, went all the way out to the main trail, stopped a stranger, and begged for help." Ethan smiled slightly. "Stubborn as they come. Wonder where she gets that." Margaret's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. Her eyes drifted closed again, but this time it was sleep rather than unconsciousness. Deep and healing and necessary. Ethan sat back, feeling tension drain from his shoulders that he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. Not light yet, but the promise of it. The suggestion that darkness always eventually gave way. Ethan stood, moving to the doorway to watch the sunrise he hadn't planned to see from this particular place. He'd stopped. Against every promise he'd made himself, every lesson learned through loss and failure, he'd stopped. And now he was here, committed to seeing this through, responsible for two people whose names he hadn't known yesterday morning. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, standing in that doorway, watching the Montana sky turn from black to gray to the palest gold, Ethan felt something he'd almost forgotten. Not quite hope. He wasn't ready for that word yet. But possibility, maybe. The sense that forward movement didn't always mean running away. Sometimes it meant planting your feet and refusing to abandon what mattered. Behind him, Lily stirred awake, sitting up with the instant alertness of a child accustomed to trouble. "Mama?" Fever broke about an hour ago. She woke up, drank some water, and went back to sleep. Ethan turned to face her. Real sleep this time, healing sleep. The expression that crossed Lily's face, relief and joy and exhaustion and gratitude all tangled together, was almost painful to witness. She scrambled off the cot, moving to her mother's bedside despite her bandaged feet, and took Margaret's hand in both of hers. "I knew you'd fight," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." Ethan looked away, giving them privacy in the moment. Through the window, full sunrise broke across the land, golden and relentless and beautiful despite everything. A new day in Montana territory. A new day for the Warren family. And somehow, impossibly, a new day for a man who'd thought he'd left new beginnings behind forever. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know how long he'd stay or what complications would arise when Margaret was well enough to understand what had happened. But for now, in this moment, watching dawn paint the world in shades of amber and watching a little girl hold her mother's hand with fierce devotion, Ethan felt the unfamiliar weight of being exactly where he needed to be. The road still stretched in all directions, offering escape and distance and the familiar comfort of isolation. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at what happened when you chose to stay. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven despite Ethan's efforts to keep the interior cool. Margaret slept through the morning, her breathing steady and her color gradually returning to something that resembled health rather than crisis. Lily refused to leave her mother's side, except when Ethan physically ordered her outside to sit in the shade. And even then she lasted maybe 10 minutes before creeping back to her post. Around midday, Ethan walked the property, partly to assess what the Warrens were working with, partly to give himself space to think. The claim wasn't large, maybe 40 acres of mixed terrain. The cabin sat near what had once been a reliable creek, now reduced to scattered pools and damp earth. A small barn leaned precariously to one side, housing nothing but old hay and broken tools. The vegetable garden was beyond saving, the fence around it sagging where posts had rotted through. But the land itself had potential. Good grazing in the lower meadow, timber in the higher elevations, water rights to the creek when it ran again. The kind of claim a man could build something on if he had the strength and stubbornness to outlast the hard years. If he had help. If he wasn't trying to do it alone while grieving and raising a child. Ethan stood at the edge of the property, looking back at the cabin. Smoke finally rose from the chimney. He'd started a fire before coming out here, put coffee on to boil, set beans to soak for supper. Domestic tasks he hadn't performed in years, muscle memory returning from a life he'd deliberately left behind. "You planning to stay past tonight?" The voice startled him. Ethan turned to find an older man approaching on foot, weathered and lean, with the cautious posture of someone expecting trouble. He wore work clothes gone threadbare and carried a rifle in the crook of his arm. Not threatening, just present. "Depends," Ethan said carefully. "You Margaret Warren's neighbor?" "Thomas Boone. My place is half-mile east, past the ridge." The man stopped at a respectful distance, eyes sharp and assessing. "Saw smoke earlier, figured someone was here. Didn't expect to find a stranger tending the fire." "Name's Ethan Cole. Margaret's daughter found me on the trail yesterday. Her mother was burning up with fever." Boone's expression flickered, something that might have been shame or guilt, quickly buried. "That's so. She pull through?" "Fever broke this morning. She's sleeping now." "That's good. That's real good." Boone shifted his weight, the rifle moving with him. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble. Just wanted to see if Margaret needed anything. Check on the girl." Ethan studied him, reading the truth beneath the words. "When's the last time you checked?" The silence stretched long enough to be damning. Boone looked away first. 3 weeks, maybe. Things have been complicated." "How so?" "You really want to know, or you just passing through?" The question held challenge and weariness in equal measure. Because if you're just here to play hero for a day or two, then ride off feeling good about yourself, you don't need the whole story. But if you're planning to stick, Boone trailed off, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. Margaret's got no use for my explanations anyway." "Try me." Boone considered this, then jerked his head toward a fallen log at the tree line. "Might want to sit. It's not a short story." They sat, and Boone pulled out a pipe, taking his time filling and lighting it. The ritual seemed to help him organize his thoughts, or maybe just delay the telling. Finally, he started talking. "Robert Warren, Margaret's husband. He was a good man. Little naive, maybe. Came out here 3 years ago with his new bride and big plans. Bought this claim from a speculator, paid fair price for it. Built that cabin himself, worked the timber contracts up in the high country, saved every penny. He and Margaret, they were going to have something real here. A home, a future." Boone paused, drawing on the pipe. Problem was, the man he bought the claim from didn't exactly have clear title. Old gambling debt tied up the land rights, and the creditor decided to call it in 6 months after Robert bought the place. Man named Clayton Voss. Runs the biggest ranch in the territory, and he's got lawyers who know every loophole ever written. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Men who used the law like a weapon, who understood that legal didn't always mean right. What did Voss want? The land. This creek runs through his property, and Margaret's both. During drought years, which is most years lately, water rights are worth more than gold. Voss figured he could pressure Robert into selling for pennies, then control the whole watershed. Boone's voice went flat. Robert refused. Said he'd paid fair price, had documentation, and wasn't budging. Took it to court. Let me guess, Voss has the judge in his pocket, among others. The case dragged on for months. Legal fees ate through Robert's savings. Then he died in that logging accident, and everything got worse. Boone looked toward the cabin, his expression heavy. Voss backed off for a while, probably figured a widow and child would fold quick, but Margaret's got steel in her spine. Refused every offer, every threat. Said this land was Robert's legacy to Lily, and she'd die before giving it up. So Voss turned the town against her. Not directly. He's too smart for that. But word got around that helping Margaret meant crossing him, Bank won't extend credit. Store won't offer terms. Doc won't come without payment up front. Boone's voice dropped, and neighbors who should have stood with her, we found reasons to look the other way. The admission hung between them, naked and shameful. Ethan didn't fill the silence, just waited. I got a wife, Boone finally continued. 3 daughters still at home. My oldest wanted to bring Margaret food last month, and I told her no. Said we couldn't afford to make enemies, not with our own troubles to manage. He knocked ash from his pipe with sharp, angry movements. That's the truth of it. I chose my family's safety over doing what was right, and I got to live with that. Ethan understood the calculation even as he despised it. Fear made cowards of good people every day. You here to ease your conscience or actually help? Both, if I'm honest. Boone met his eyes squarely. If you're staying, really staying, you need to know what you're walking into. Voss isn't going to like some stranger playing protector. He's got men who handle problems, and they're not gentle about it. I've dealt with men like that before. You law? The question was sharp, assessing. Was. Not anymore. Boone absorbed this, nodding slowly. Well, former law or not, you keep Margaret and that girl safe. You'll have at least one neighbor who'll stand with you when it counts. I owe them that much. Words are easy. Being there when things get hard, that's what matters. You're right. Boone stood, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. I'll bring supplies by tomorrow. Food, medicine, whatever you need. And I'll spread word that Margaret's got someone looking out for her interests now. Might make Voss think twice. Or make him move faster. That's possible too. Boone started walking, then turned back. Fair warning, Cole. Margaret Warren doesn't suffer charity well. She's proud, probably too proud for her own good. When she's back on her feet, she's going to have questions about who you are and why you helped. Best figure out your answers now. Ethan watched him disappear into the trees, then sat alone with his thoughts and the smell of pine and dust. The situation was worse than he'd imagined. Not just a sick woman and struggling child, but a powerful enemy willing to use isolation and fear as weapons. The smart play would be to help Margaret recover, then move on before Voss noticed his presence. Staying meant trouble, the kind that could get bloody. But when he thought about Lily's blistered feet and desperate eyes, about Margaret fighting fever alone because her neighbors were too afraid to help, about a dead man's dream of home being stolen by lawyers and greed, the smart play felt like cowardice. He walked back to the cabin slowly, trying to sort through the tangle of obligation and instinct that kept him rooted here. Through the window, he could see Lily sitting beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from a book with careful concentration. The scene was so ordinary, so domestic, it made his chest ache with memories he usually kept locked away. Inside, the cabin smelled like coffee and wood smoke and sickness giving way to recovery. Margaret was awake, propped up slightly on pillows, her eyes tracking Lily's reading even though she clearly lacked the strength for much else. She noticed Ethan immediately, her gaze sharpening despite the lingering fever flush. "You're the man from the trail." Her voice was rough, each word an effort. "Lily told me. Said you came when no one else would." "Ethan Cole, ma'am." "Margaret Warren, though I suppose you already know that." She paused, gathering strength. "My daughter says you paid the doctor. Stayed through the night. Tended me like family. Anyone would have done the same." "No." The word came out firm despite its whisper quality. "They wouldn't. They didn't." Her eyes held his, searching. "Why did you?" It was the question Boone had warned him about, the one Ethan had been asking himself since he first dismounted to help a desperate child. He could give easy answers, basic decency, Christian duty, the right thing to do. But Margaret Warren deserved better than comfortable lies. "Because your daughter wouldn't let me ride past," he said quietly. "Because she stood in that trail with burned feet and begged for help, and I couldn't be the kind of man who says no to that." Something in Margaret's expression softened. Lily's good at not giving up. Gets that from her father. She looked toward her daughter, who had stopped reading to listen. "Come here, sweetheart." Lily moved to the bedside, and Margaret took her hand with visible effort. "Mr. Cole saved my life, you understand that? He didn't have to stop, didn't have to help, but he did. We owe him a debt we can't repay." "Actually," Ethan said, pulling the second chair close, "we should talk about that. About debts and payment and what happens next. Margaret's spine straightened despite her weakness. I don't take charity, Mr. Cole. Didn't figure you did. That's why I'm bringing it up now, while you're too weak to throw me out. He almost smiled at the flash of irritation in her eyes. Good to see some fire returning. Here's the situation as I understand it. You're recovering from fever that nearly killed you. Your daughter has burns on her feet that need at least a week to heal. Your property needs work, your supplies are low, and you've got a powerful enemy who wants this land. Margaret's jaw tightened. Lily told you about Clayton Voss. Thomas Boone told me about Clayton Voss. Lily just said people weren't kind after your husband died. Boone came by? Surprise colored Margaret's voice. That's unexpected. Said he'd bring supplies tomorrow. Said he was sorry. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees. Point is, you need help. Not charity, help. And I'm offering to stay on for a while, work the property in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. Call it even trade. A place to sleep where, exactly? We've only got one bed and Lily's cot. Barnes got a loft. I've slept in worse. Margaret studied him with the intensity of someone trying to read truth from shadows. Your former law. What are you running from? The directness of the question was refreshing and unsettling in equal measure. What makes you think I'm running? Because men don't give up a badge and drift unless something broke them first. No judgment in her voice, just observation. And you've got the look of someone who's been broken. Lily shifted uncomfortably, but Ethan raised a hand. It's a fair question. He took a breath, choosing words carefully. I was town marshal in Virginia City, had a wife, a daughter about Lily's age. Fever came through 3 years back, and I couldn't save them. Lost them both in the same week. The words came out flat, factual. After that, the badge felt like wearing a lie. So I took it off and started moving. The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of fire and the wind outside. Margaret's expression shifted through understanding, sympathy, and something that looked like recognition, one wounded soul acknowledging another. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. Truly. But Mr. Cole, if you're staying here thinking you can make up for what you couldn't do then, I'm not. Ethan met her eyes steadily. I can't fix the past. Can't bring back what's gone. But I can repair a fence, fix that barn roof before it collapses, chop wood for winter. Practical things. Nothing more complicated than that. And when Voss comes, when he sends men to run you off or worse, I'll handle it. You say that like you've done it before. I have. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still entwined with Lily's, her gaze moving between her daughter and the stranger who'd inserted himself into their lives. Finally, she spoke. 1 month. You stay 1 month, help get us through the worst of recovery, and get the property secured for winter. After that, we reassess based on how things stand. She held up a hand before Ethan could respond. But I'm paying you. Not much. We don't have much. But you'll get fair wage for fair work. We're not charity cases, Mr. Cole. Ethan. And those terms are acceptable. Good. Margaret settled back against the pillows, exhaustion creeping into her features. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to sleep. Lily, make sure he knows where everything is. And Ethan? She waited until he looked at her. Thank you. For stopping. For staying. You already thanked me. I know. But it needed saying twice. As Margaret's eyes drifted closed, Lily tugged Ethan's sleeve, pulling him toward the door. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed relentless and bright. The girl led him to the barn, pointing out the loft access and the pile of old blankets that could serve as bedding. She likes you, Lily said matter-of-factly. Mama doesn't trust Easy anymore, but I can tell she trusts you. What about you? You trust me? Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. You came when I asked. You stayed when you could have left. You helped Mama when nobody else would. She nodded firmly. Yeah, I trust you. The simple faith in her voice was humbling and terrifying. Ethan cleared his throat. Well then, guess we better make good on that trust. Show me what needs doing around here. They spent the afternoon taking inventory. The barn needed major work. The fence was beyond simple repair in multiple sections. The well pump required parts they'd have to order from town. The list of necessary tasks grew longer with each inspection, and Ethan found himself mentally calculating costs and time and the supplies Boone had promised. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ethan started supper while Lily sat with her mother. He worked with the limited supplies available: beans, bacon, some withered potatoes from the cellar. Not much, but he made it stretch, years of trail cooking coming back like second nature. Margaret woke as the smell of food filled the cabin. She tried to sit up, moving with painful slowness, and Ethan brought her a tin plate with small portions. "You need to eat," he said, helping her get settled, "even if it's just a little." She managed half the beans and a few bites of bacon before exhaustion claimed her again. Lily ate with mechanical efficiency, her eyes drooping despite her best efforts to stay alert. Ethan sent her to bed early, then sat at the table with his own meal, listening to the evening sounds outside. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Closer in, an owl called from the pines. The cabin settled around him with creaks and sighs, and Ethan felt the strange displacement of being in a home that wasn't his, caring for people he barely knew, committed to a month that could change everything or mean nothing. He cleaned up the dishes, banked the fire for the night, and checked on Margaret one final time. She slept deeply, her breathing even, color almost normal in the lamplight. Progress. Real, measurable progress. In the barn loft, Ethan arranged blankets over old hay, creating a surprisingly comfortable bed. He lay back, looking through gaps in the roof at stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The colt rested within easy reach, old habits from dangerous years. Sleep came slowly, his mind turning over everything Boone had said about Voss and legal battles and neighbors too afraid to help. Tomorrow, he'd start on the fence. Day after, the barn roof. Small victories against overwhelming odds, but victories nonetheless. And maybe, if he was lucky and Voss was patient, he'd buy Margaret enough time to heal and Lily enough time to be a child again instead of a tiny adult carrying the weight of survival. It wasn't redemption. Wasn't forgiveness for his failures or healing for his losses, but it was something. A purpose beyond the next horizon. A reason to stay in one place long enough to actually make a difference. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Thomas Boone probably struggled with his conscience. Somewhere in a ranch house built on stolen land, Clayton Voss likely plotted his next move. And here, in a barn loft on a struggling claim, a former lawman tried to convince himself he wasn't making a terrible mistake. Morning would bring answers or more questions. For now, there was just the darkness and the sound of wind in the pines, and the knowledge that tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all over again. Because he'd said he would stay. And despite everything, despite the danger and the complications and the echoes of old grief, Ethan Cole was discovering he meant it. The night deepened around him, and eventually sleep came. Dreamless and heavy, the sleep of a man who'd worked hard and committed to something beyond himself. In the cabin, Margaret rested with her daughter curled close, both of them breathing easy for the first time in days. And outside, the Montana darkness held its breath, waiting to see what dawn would bring. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that promised heat later but started with frost on the grass and breath visible in the air. Ethan woke to the sound of a wagon rattling up the trail, and he was on his feet with the colt in hand before his mind fully caught up to his instincts. Through the barn slats, he saw Thomas Boone pulling up in front of the cabin, the wagon bed loaded with supplies. Ethan holstered the pistol and climbed down from the loft, meeting Boone as the older man began unloading sacks of flour and beans. "Wasn't sure you'd actually come." "Said I would, didn't I?" Boone handed him a 20-pound sack. "Got staples here: flour, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, some salt pork and dried apples. My wife sent preserves and a loaf of bread that's still warm. There's also medicine, more willow bark, and some chamomile tea that's good for settling the stomach after fever." They worked in silence, transferring the supplies to the cabin's small porch. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt despite the morning chill, her face drawn but alert. She watched Boone with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part wariness, part something harder that might have been anger held in check. "Thomas," her voice was steady, giving nothing away. "Margaret?" Boone removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Heard you took sick. Thought you might need a few things." That's kind of you. The words were polite and empty, carrying none of the warmth that should accompany acceptance of neighborly help. Boone heard it too, his weathered face tightening with shame. Margaret, I know I got no right to ask, but you're right, you don't. She cut him off cleanly without raising her voice. But I'm grateful for the supplies nonetheless. Lily, come help put these away? Lily emerged from the cabin, moving carefully on her bandaged feet. She gave Boone a small smile that he returned with visible relief. At least the child didn't hate him. The girl began organizing the food stores while Margaret retreated inside, leaving Ethan and Boone standing in the awkward aftermath. She's not wrong to be angry, Boone said quietly. I failed her when she needed help most. You're here now, that counts for something. Does it? Or am I just easing my conscience while she still faces the same threats that made me turn away in the first place? Boone secured the empty wagon bed, preparing to leave. Word's spreading that she's got help now. Some folks are relieved. They never liked abandoning her, just didn't have the spine to stand up. Others, he trailed off, shaking his head. Others are reporting back to Voss. Most likely, he's got eyes all over this territory. Give it a week, maybe less, and he'll know exactly who you are and why you're here. Boone climbed onto the wagon seat. Watch yourself, Cole. And watch that little girl. Voss isn't above using children to get what he wants. After Boone left, Ethan spent the morning working on the fence line, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire that had snapped under pressure. The physical labor felt good, familiar. The bite of the post hole digger into hard earth, the swing of the hammer driving stakes, the burn in his shoulders as he stretched wire taut. Honest work that produced visible results. Lily brought him water around midday, settling herself on a flat rock to watch him work. Mama's sleeping again. She ate some bread and preserves for breakfast, then got tired. That's normal. Her body's still recovering. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead, studying the fence line stretching ahead. This is going to take longer than I thought. Your father built solid, but time and weather don't care about good craftsmanship. Papa used to say that work done right lasts, but nothing lasts forever without maintenance. Lily picked at a loose thread on her dress. He was always fixing something. Mama would laugh and say he couldn't sit still for 5 minutes without finding a project. Sounds like a good man. He was the best. Her voice stayed matter-of-fact, but pain flickered across her young face. He used to take me up to the timber camp sometimes, let me ride on the wagon and showed me how to spot good trees from bad. Said one day this would all be mine, and I needed to know the land like I knew my own name. Ethan drove another post, giving her space to talk or not talk as she chose. After a moment, Lily continued, Mr. Voss came to see us right after Papa died, brought flowers and said how sorry he was. Told Mama he understood how hard it would be to manage alone, and he'd be willing to buy the claim for a fair price so she and I could start fresh somewhere easier. Lily's hands clenched in her skirt. Mama thanked him polite-like, then said no. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. Said she should think carefully about what was best for her daughter. That Montana territory wasn't kind to women who bit off more than they could chew. What did your mother say? She said she'd been chewing on difficult things her whole life and hadn't choked yet. Then she closed the door in his face. Pride shone in Lily's eyes. Papa would have been proud of her for that. Ethan smiled despite the situation. I bet he would have. They worked together through the afternoon, Ethan on the fence, Lily bringing water and handing him tools, talking about her father and the life they'd built before tragedy reshaped everything. As the sun began its descent, they headed back to the cabin, both tired and dusty and somehow more comfortable with each other than they'd been the day before. Margaret was awake, sitting at the table with what looked like a ledger book spread before her. She glanced up as they entered, and Ethan noticed the hard set of her jaw. We need to talk about money. Ethan poured water from the pitcher, washing dust from his hands and face. All right. Sit down, both of you. Margaret waited until they were settled, then turned the ledger so Ethan could see the columns of careful figures. This is what we owe. Dr. Peters, $8, which you paid. Thomas Boone for today's supplies. I'm estimating $15 based on what he brought. Food and board for you for the month we agreed on. We said even trade, Ethan interrupted. Work for room and board. We said that, yes, but I've been lying here thinking, and it's not even. You're doing labor that would cost me at least $1 a day, if I hired it done. That's $30 for the month, plus the $8 you already spent, plus whatever other expenses come up. She met his eyes steadily. I can't pay you now. Don't have the cash, but I'm keeping record of every cent owed, and when we get back on our feet, you'll be paid in full. Margaret, this isn't negotiable, Ethan. You want to help. I appreciate it. You want charity to make yourself feel better? There's a church in town that takes donations. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. I'm offering you honest work for honest pay, just delayed. You can accept those terms or ride out today. Your choice. Lily looked between them, tension evident in her small frame. Ethan studied Margaret, this woman who'd nearly died 3 days ago, but had enough steel in her spine to dictate terms from a sickbed. He recognized the pride in her stance, the absolute refusal to be pitied or patronized. It was the same stubborn dignity that had kept her fighting for this land, despite losing her husband and facing an enemy with more power and resources than she'd ever have. All right, he said quietly. Keep your ledger. When you're in a position to settle accounts, we'll settle accounts. Some of the tension left Margaret's shoulders. Thank you. She closed the book carefully. Now, since we're being honest about the situation, you should know what else I've been thinking about. Voss won't wait forever. The legal case is still pending, but judges move slow and lawyers cost money I don't have. He'll make another move soon, and when he does, it won't be flowers and false sympathy. Boone said the same thing. Thomas Boone is right about that much, at least. Margaret's expression hardened. Voss has used fear to isolate us. Now that you're here, he'll try intimidation next. Then escalation if that doesn't work. He wants this land, and he's not a patient man despite playing the long game. What would it take to beat him legally? Proof that the original sale was legitimate and the gambling debt he's claiming is false or satisfied. Margaret rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping back into her features. Robert spent months gathering documents, talking to witnesses. He had most of what we needed, but then she trailed off, the unfinished sentence heavy with loss. Where are the documents now? Safe? Hidden. I'm not fool enough to keep them in the cabin where they could be stolen or destroyed. She looked at him carefully. Why? You thinking of taking up Robert's fight? I'm thinking information is useful, and if Voss is going to make a move, better to be prepared than caught flat-footed. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Lily, go fetch the papers from Papa's spot. You know the one. Lily nodded and disappeared outside. Margaret leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly fragile despite her fierce words moments before. I don't know if you're brave or foolish, Ethan Cole. Maybe both. But I'm grateful you're here, even if it complicates everything. Complications seem to find me whether I invite them or not. That's the truth of living, isn't it? We make plans and life laughs. She managed a small smile. Robert used to say the only difference between an adventure and a disaster is whether you survive it. I'm determined to survive this, for Lily's sake if nothing else. That little girl deserves the future her father worked to give her. Lily returned carrying a leather document case, obviously old and well-maintained. She handed it to her mother, who opened it carefully and pulled out a sheaf of papers, contracts, correspondence, official-looking documents with seals and signatures. This is everything Robert compiled. The original land deed. Letters from the speculator who sold us the claim. Statements from 3 witnesses who swear the gambling debt Voss is claiming never existed or was settled years before Robert bought the land. Margaret spread the papers across the table. There's also this. A letter Robert received a week before he died. Anonymous. It warned him that Voss was planning to fabricate evidence if the legal route didn't work fast enough. Ethan picked up the letter, noting the educated handwriting and careful phrasing. Someone on the inside. Someone who knew Voss's plans and had the courage to warn your husband. But not the courage to testify publicly or sign their name. Margaret's voice carried bitter understanding. Fear makes cowards of good people, like Thomas Boone said. Whoever wrote this probably has family to protect, debts Voss holds, something that keeps them silent when it matters most. Or they're still gathering information, building a case that can't be dismissed or bought off. Ethan set the letter down carefully. Either way, this is valuable. It shows Voss's intent to commit fraud, which could invalidate anything he presents to the court. Only if we can prove he wrote it, which we can't. Anonymous letters aren't evidence, just suggestions. Margaret gathered the papers, returning them to the case. But you're right that it's valuable. It tells us Voss is willing to break the law to get what he wants. And if he was willing to fabricate evidence 6 months ago, he's certainly willing now. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, multiple horses, moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Ethan was at the window immediately, his hand automatically checking the colt's position. Through the dusty glass, he counted 4 riders coming up the trail, all well-mounted and moving with the casual authority of men who expected no resistance. "Lily, go to your room," Margaret said, her voice sharp with command. The girl obeyed without question, disappearing behind the thin curtain that separated the sleeping area. Margaret stood slowly, supporting herself on the table, her face pale but determined. "This is it. This is Voss's next move." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their horses stamping and blowing in the afternoon heat. The man in front was perhaps 40, well-dressed for the territory in a black suit and polished boots, his face handsome in a cold way that suggested cruelty masked by good manners. He dismounted with practiced ease, handing his reins to one of the other men without looking. Ethan stepped onto the porch before the man could knock, positioning himself between the door and whoever this was. Up close, he could see the calculation in the stranger's eyes, the quick assessment of Ethan as potential obstacle or threat. "Help you, gentlemen?" Ethan kept his voice neutral, his stance relaxed but ready. The well-dressed man smiled, showing white teeth that somehow made him look more predatory. "I'm looking for Margaret Warren. I'm Clayton Voss, and I own most of the land around these parts. You must be the drifter who's been helping out." "Ethan Cole, and I'm not drifting at the moment." "So I've heard." Voss's gaze moved past Ethan to the cabin interior, where Margaret stood visible in the doorway. "Mrs. Warren, I heard you took ill. I trust you're recovering." "Well enough." Margaret's voice was ice over steel. "What do you want, Clayton?" "Just being neighborly, checking on your welfare." Voss gestured to his men. "Brought some supplies to help you through. Flour, sugar, coffee, basics that a household needs." "We have what we need, thank you." "Do you?" Voss's smile didn't waver. "Because from what I hear, you were at death's door just days ago, your daughter running barefoot through town begging for help. That doesn't sound like a household managing just fine." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "We had a difficult few days. It's past now." "Thanks to Mr. Cole here, apparently." Voss turned his attention back to Ethan, eyes assessing and cold. "That was real Christian of you, helping a widow in distress. Though I have to wonder what brings a former lawman to our little corner of Montana, working for room and board on a failing claim." So Voss already knew who he was. Ethan filed that information away, along with the implied threat in the man's tone. "Just passing through, saw someone who needed help." "Passing through, but staying for a month, from what I understand." Voss stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "Let me give you some free advice, Cole. This situation is more complicated than it looks. Margaret Warren is squatting on land she doesn't legally own, refusing reasonable offers to sell, making things harder than they need to be. The smart thing, the kind thing really, would be to help her see reason, help her accept that some fights can't be won, and moving on is better than destroying herself trying to hold on to a dream that died with her husband. Seems to me that's her decision, not yours or mine." "In principle, sure. But in practice?" Voss's smile turned sharp. "You're a man who's seen how the world works. You know law and justice aren't always the same thing, and you know that people who get between me and what's mine tend to regret it." The threat was naked now, barely dressed in civilized language. Ethan held Voss's gaze without flinching. "I appreciate the advice, but I made a commitment to help Mrs. Warren for a month, and I keep my word." "A month?" Voss nodded slowly. "Well, that's not so long. Lots can happen in a month, of course. Accidents, complications. Sometimes help that seems good turns out to cause more problems than it solves." He raised his voice, addressing Margaret again. Mrs. Warren, my offer stands, $50 for the claim, enough to get you and your daughter somewhere safer. Think about it carefully. For Lily's sake. Margaret's face went white with fury. Get off my land, Clayton. Technically, it's not your land yet. That's still being determined by the courts, but I'll respect your wishes. Voss mounted his horse with easy grace. Mr. Cole, I'm sure we'll meet again. Gentlemen, let's go. They rode out slowly, taking their time, making a show of their leisure and confidence. Ethan watched until they disappeared around the bend, his instincts screaming warnings his conscious mind didn't need spelled out. Behind him, Margaret sagged against the doorframe, the brief surge of adrenaline leaving her shaky and pale. Ethan caught her arm, supporting her weight. Inside. You need to sit down before you fall down. She didn't argue, letting him guide her to the chair. Lily emerged from behind the curtain, her young face tight with fear. Was that him? Was that Mr. Voss? That was him. Margaret pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. But he's gone now. He'll be back. Ethan moved to the window, scanning the empty trail. That wasn't a social call or a genuine offer. That was reconnaissance. He wanted to see how you'd react, see if I was someone who'd fold under pressure, get a feel for the situation. And what did he learn? That you're not backing down, that I'm not leaving, and that he'll need to escalate if he wants to move this along. Ethan turned from the window. We need to be ready for that escalation, which means I need to understand the full legal situation, who the judge is, what leverage Voss actually has versus what he's bluffing about. Margaret nodded slowly. There's a lawyer in Helena who helped Robert initially, Samuel Tucker. He's honest, which is rare, and he knows the case. But his fees, she trailed off, the reality of their financial situation a constant weight. Write him a letter, explain what's happening. Maybe he'll take the case on contingency if he believes you've got a chance of winning. Ethan pulled out the second chair, straddling it backwards. In the meantime, we secure this place. Fix what's broken, make it harder for anyone to cause trouble without being obvious about it. And we make sure Lily's never alone, never vulnerable. You really think he'd hurt a child? I think he'd use whatever leverage he could find, and a scared little girl is powerful leverage. Ethan's voice was flat, remembering too many cases where children became pawns in adult conflicts. Better safe than sorry. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her hand smoothing Lily's hair with automatic tenderness. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was committing to something irrevocable. If we do this, if we really fight instead of just enduring, it changes everything. Voss won't just want the land anymore. He'll want to make an example of us, show the whole territory what happens to people who defy him. I know. And you're still willing to stay? To stand with us even though this isn't your fight? Ethan met her eyes across the small table, seeing the fear and hope and desperate courage all tangled together. He thought about riding away, about the peace of solitude and the safety of not caring. But he also thought about Lily's blistered feet and Margaret's fever-bright eyes and the way this broken family had somehow lodged itself under his ribs, where old scars lived. It became my fight the moment I dismounted to help a little girl on a dusty road, he said quietly. So yeah, I'm still willing to stay. Margaret's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. Then we fight, together, and we win this the right way, through the courts, with the truth on our side. And if the courts fail, then we find another way, because I promised Robert on his deathbed that I'd protect what he built, and I keep my promises. She stood carefully, steadying herself. Lily, help me write that letter to Mr. Tucker. Ethan, you should probably reinforce the barn door. If Voss decides to make things difficult, he'll go for the easy targets first. They moved into action with the focused purpose of people who'd accepted the weight of their decision. Lily brought out paper and ink while Margaret composed careful sentences explaining their situation. Ethan headed to the barn with tools and determination, checking every weak point in the structure. As he worked, the sun sank lower, painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and crimson. Beautiful and indifferent, the kind of sunset that had witnessed 1,000 human struggles and would witness 1,000 more. Ethan drove nails with steady rhythm, each strike an act of defiance against the entropy trying to pull this place apart. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Clayton Voss was probably planning his next move, confident in his power and position. But here, in this small cabin with its scarred table and determined occupants, something else was growing. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile for what they faced. But resolve, maybe. The stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered just because the fight looked impossible. Ethan finished securing the barn as full dark settled over the land. Walking back to the cabin, he could see lamplight glowing warm through the window, could hear the soft murmur of voices as Margaret and Lily talked. For a moment, standing in the darkness looking at that golden light, he felt the ghost of what home used to mean, before loss taught him that belonging was just another word for eventual grief. But maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the risk of caring again. He stepped into the cabin's warmth, closing the door firmly behind him, and began planning for the battle ahead. The letter to Samuel Tucker went out with Thomas Boone the next morning, carried with promises that he'd see it posted from town and paid for from his own pocket until Margaret could settle the debt. 2 weeks passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy and tension. Ethan worked the property from dawn to dusk. Margaret recovered her strength with stubborn determination, and Lily divided her time between helping her mother and trailing after Ethan like a small, curious shadow. The fence got finished. The barn roof stopped leaking. The well pump received new leather gaskets that Ethan fashioned himself from an old saddle he found rotting in the back of the barn. Small victories that added up to something more substantial. The property stopped looking quite so defeated, quite so ready to surrender to the elements and time. But beneath the surface of productive days, everyone felt the waiting. The sense that Voss's visit had been a warning shot, and the real battle was still coming. Margaret healed faster than expected, driven by will as much as medicine. By the end of the second week, she was up and moving around the cabin, cooking meals and managing the household, despite Ethan's protest that she should rest longer. She had a quiet strength about her, a competence that spoke to years of managing on frontier edges where weakness meant death and complaint accomplished nothing. One evening, as they sat around the table after supper, she broke the comfortable silence with a question that had clearly been building for days. "Tell me about Virginia City, about your family." Ethan's hands stilled on the piece of harness he'd been mending. Lily looked up from her reader, sensing the shift in atmosphere. For a moment he considered deflecting, giving the same brief answer he'd offered before. But Margaret's eyes held genuine interest rather than mere curiosity, and somehow that made honesty easier. "Her name was Catherine. We met in Denver. She was teaching school, and I was working as a deputy. Married 3 years before Sarah came along." The names felt strange in his mouth after so long unspoken. Sarah had her mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. She was 6 when the fever came through. The same fever that took her mother? Same week, different days. Ethan set down the leather, his hands needing something to do. He reached for his coffee cup instead, though it had long since gone cold. Catherine went first, took sick on a Monday, gone by Wednesday. I was so focused on her trying every remedy the doctor suggested that I didn't notice Sarah's symptoms until it was too late. She lasted 4 days, long enough for me to think maybe she'd pull through, long enough for hope to make the loss worse. Lily's eyes were wide and solemn. "Did you bury them together?" "Side by side, up on the hill overlooking town." Catherine would have liked that view. She always said the mountains made her feel closer to something eternal. His voice stayed steady through sheer force of will. "I kept the badge for 6 more months. Thought maybe work would help, keeping busy would ease it. But every domestic dispute, every drunk cowboy, every petty theft, it all felt so damn meaningless compared to what I'd lost." "So you left." Margaret's tone held no judgment, just understanding. "So I left. Figured if I kept moving, the grief couldn't catch up. Turns out it travels just fine, but at least I wasn't surrounded by memories every time I turned a corner." Ethan managed something close to a smile. "Been drifting ever since. Nearly 3 years of seeing new places and forgetting them just as quick. Until a little girl grabbed your boot and wouldn't let go." "Until that, yeah." Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. The gesture was brief, almost businesslike, but the warmth of human connection behind it made Ethan's throat tighten. "Thank you for telling us. I know it's not easy, speaking the names of people we've lost." "Your turn, then. Fair's fair. Tell me about Robert." A smile ghosted across Margaret's face, soft with memory. Robert Warren was the most optimistic man I ever met, sometimes dangerously so. He'd look at a half-dead claim and see paradise, look at a rickety cabin and see a manor house. But that optimism wasn't foolish. He worked himself to exhaustion making his visions real, and most of the time he succeeded. How'd you meet him? Baltimore, of all places. I was working in my uncle's dry goods store, and Robert came through buying supplies for the journey west. He had this energy about him, this absolute certainty that Montana Territory was where he belonged. Margaret's hands wrapped around her own cup, seeking warmth or comfort. He came back 3 times before asking me to come with him. Said he couldn't offer me much yet, but he'd build something worth having if I was willing to wait and work alongside him. And you said yes. I said yes. My family thought I was insane. Well-bred Baltimore girl running off to the wilderness with a dreamer. But Robert made me feel alive in a way that sitting behind a counter, counting pennies never would. She looked around the cabin with fierce affection. We had 3 good years, hard years certainly, but good. We built this together, plank by plank, dream by dream. And when Lily came, her voice softened impossibly. Robert cried when she was born. Big, strong man who could fell trees all day, and he stood there holding this tiny baby like she was made of glass, tears streaming down his face. Lily smiled at the story she'd clearly heard before, but never tired of. Mama says I had Papa wrapped around my finger from day 1. You absolutely did. He'd have given you the moon if you'd asked for it. Margaret's expression turned sad. I think that's why he fought Voss so hard. It wasn't just about the land or his pride. It was about giving you the inheritance he'd promised, securing your future so you'd never have to depend on anyone else's charity or kindness. Instead, I grabbed a stranger's boot and begged. Lily's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan heard the echo of his own earlier words about dependence and survival. You did what you had to do, which is exactly what your father would have wanted. Ethan met the girl's eyes directly. There's no shame in asking for help when you need it. The shame belongs to people who could help but choose not to. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that. Lily's schooling, which had been irregular since Robert's death, Margaret's plans for the garden come spring, Ethan's thoughts on maybe running some cattle if the water situation improved. The kind of talk that families engaged in, planning futures that might or might not come to pass, but felt solid in the speaking. Later, as Ethan headed out to the barn for the night, Margaret stopped him at the door. You're good with her, with Lily. She kept her voice low so the girl wouldn't hear from where she was preparing for bed. She started smiling again, laughing even. I'd almost forgotten what that sounded like. She's a good kid, easy to be around. She's a child who lost her father and nearly lost her mother, who's had to grow up too fast and carry burdens no 8-year-old should know exist. Margaret's eyes were fierce in the lamplight. But when you're here, she gets to just be a child again. That's a gift, Ethan. Don't diminish it. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and stepped into the night. The barn loft had become familiar. The smell of hay and old leather, the sound of wind through the gaps in the boards, the particular quality of darkness that came from being surrounded by honest work and simple materials. He lay back on his makeshift bed, staring at the stars through the roof gaps he still hadn't gotten around to patching. 3 weeks down. 1 week left on the month he'd promised. The thought sat heavy in his chest, complicated and uncomfortable. The smart thing would be to finish out the week and move on. He'd done what he said he'd do, helped them through the crisis, left them better than he'd found them. Staying longer meant deeper involvement, meant risking the kind of attachment that led to loss and pain. But the thought of riding away from this place, from these people, felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like leaving a job half-finished or walking out in the middle of a promise. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams of fences that needed mending, and a little girl's laughter, and a woman's steady eyes seeing more than he wanted to reveal. The answer to the unspoken question came 3 days later, but not in the way anyone expected. Ethan was working on the creek bed, trying to dig out some of the silt and debris that had accumulated during the drought, when he heard the sound of a single horse approaching at speed. He was on his feet immediately, hand moving to the colt as he scanned the trail. The rider came into view, a young man, maybe 20, pushing his horse harder than was wise on rough terrain. The kid pulled up near the cabin, nearly falling from the saddle in his haste. Ethan reached him in seconds, steadying him as he found his feet. "You Ethan Cole?" The young man's face was flushed with exertion and excitement. "I am. Who's asking?" "Danny Tucker, sir. Samuel Tucker's my pa. He's the lawyer in Helena. He sent me with a message for Mrs. Warren, said it was urgent enough to ride through the night." Danny pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket. "Where is she?" Margaret appeared in the doorway, alerted by the commotion. "I'm Margaret Warren. You have news from Mr. Tucker?" "Yes, ma'am. Pa said to tell you he's found something. Something big." Danny handed over the envelope with the gravity of someone who understood its importance, even if he didn't know the details. Margaret broke the seal with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the page rapidly. Ethan watched her face transform, shock, then fierce hope, then something like vindication. When she looked up, tears streamed down her cheeks, but she was smiling. He found the witness, the man who held the original gambling debt that Voss claims gives him rights to this land. He's alive, living in Oregon, and he's willing to testify that the debt was settled in full 15 years ago. The debt Voss is using to challenge our ownership doesn't exist anymore. Her voice broke. "It never did. Voss fabricated the whole thing." "There's more, ma'am," Danny said eagerly. "Pa found 3 other families Voss did the same thing to, built fake cases, used intimidation, forced them off their land. If we can get them all to testify together, along with the original creditor, we can prove a pattern of fraud. The judge would have to rule against Voss, maybe even bring criminal charges." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, the tight knot of worry that had lived there since Voss's visit. "When's the hearing?" Margaret scanned the letter again. 2 weeks. Mr. Tucker's filing an emergency motion to bring the case forward based on new evidence. He says— She paused, reading carefully. "He says if we can hold out until then, if Voss doesn't force a confrontation before we get to court, we can win this. Really win it." 2 weeks. Ethan turned the timeline over in his mind. That's 14 days for Voss to realize his legal case is about to collapse and decide to handle things a different way. The joy in Margaret's face dimmed slightly as the reality of what he was saying sank in. "You think he'll try something violent?" "I think a man who's willing to commit fraud on this scale won't hesitate to take more direct action if he feels cornered." Ethan looked at Danny. "Does your father think Voss knows about the witness yet?" "No, sir. Pa's been real careful, keeping everything quiet. But word spreads and Voss has informants everywhere. Pa said to assume you've got maybe a week before Voss hears something and reacts." "Then we prepare for that reaction." Ethan's mind was already cataloging resources and vulnerabilities. "Danny, you tell your father we'll be at that hearing, and we'll bring whatever evidence he needs, but he should know we might be arriving with trouble on our heels." The young man nodded seriously. "I'll tell him, sir. He also said to give you this." Danny pulled a small leather wallet from his pocket. "Said you'd understand what it meant." Ethan opened the wallet and felt time collapse. Inside was a deputy's badge, brass worn smooth from years of use, with a note in careful handwriting. "Sometimes the law needs good men wearing tin stars. Sometimes it just needs good men willing to stand. Either way, you're needed. S. Tucker." He stared at the badge for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just authority, but responsibility. The choice to stand between innocent people and those who'd harmed them, regardless of personal cost. It was everything he'd walked away from after Virginia City, everything he'd sworn he'd never carry again. "Ethan?" Margaret's voice was soft, questioning. He closed the wallet, tucking it into his pocket. "Tell your father I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need a badge to do what's right." Danny mounted up, considerably more composed than when he'd arrived. "I'll be back in a week to escort you all to Helena for the hearing. Pa said to stay alert and don't take any unnecessary risks." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am, my pa believes in your case. He wouldn't have taken it on if he didn't think you could win." After Danny rode off, Margaret and Ethan stood in the yard, the letter clutched in her hands like a talisman. Lily emerged from the cabin, drawn by the sound of voices, her face bright with curiosity. "Mama, what's happened?" Margaret knelt down, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace. "We're going to win, baby. We're going to keep our home. Your papa's dream is going to survive. She held Lily tight, tears flowing freely now. He didn't die for nothing. All his work, all his fighting, it mattered. It's going to matter. Watching them, Ethan felt the familiar ache of witnessing joy he couldn't fully share. But beneath that ache was something new, satisfaction, maybe. The sense that his choice to stop, to stay, to stand with these strangers had been the right one despite all his fears. The celebration was short-lived. That night, as they sat around the table discussing the hearing and what testimony Margaret might need to provide, they heard it, the sound of horses in the darkness, multiple riders moving with purpose toward the cabin. Ethan was at the window before the others could react, counting shadows against the starlight. 6 riders, maybe 7, approaching from the direction of Voss's ranch. They weren't bothering with stealth, which meant they weren't worried about witnesses or consequences. "Lily, get under the bed, now." Ethan's voice was calm but absolute. "Margaret, douse the lamps." The cabin plunged into darkness as Margaret killed the lights. Through the window, Ethan watched the riders form a loose circle around the property, blocking all easy escape routes. They weren't here for conversation. A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and familiar. "Mrs. Warren, I think we need to talk. Why don't you and your friend step outside where we can all be civilized about this?" Clayton Voss sat his horse like a man accustomed to being obeyed, surrounded by hired muscle that made their intentions clear without saying a word. Ethan checked the colt, making sure it moved smooth in the holster, then caught Margaret's arm as she moved toward the door. "You stay inside with Lily. Whatever happens, you stay inside and you don't open this door unless I tell you it's safe. Understand? Ethan, you can't face them alone. I'm not facing them. I'm talking to them. There's a difference." He squeezed her arm gently. "Trust me." He stepped onto the porch before she could argue further, closing the door firmly behind him. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the smell of horse sweat and tobacco, and something else, the sharp tang of violence waiting to happen. "Voss, didn't expect you to make social calls after dark." "This isn't a social call, Cole. This is a final warning." Voss's voice was hard, the veneer of civility stripped away. "I know about Tucker. I know about the witness in Oregon and the emergency hearing, and I'm here to tell you it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that you're about to be exposed as a fraud? Seems like it should matter quite a bit. What matters is reality, not legal niceties. The reality is this land is mine, by right of power, if not by right of law. The reality is Margaret Warren can't hold it alone, and you can't hold it for her." Voss leaned forward in the saddle. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to convince Margaret to sign over the deed tonight, right now. In exchange, I'll give her $75, more than fair, and safe passage to wherever she wants to go. You'll ride out with them, and everyone walks away intact. And if we refuse, then my men will encourage you to reconsider. And if that encouragement gets rough, well, accidents happen on frontier properties all the time. Lanterns get knocked over. Fires spread. People trying to escape sometimes don't make it out. The threat was naked now. No pretense of civilization left. I'm offering you a choice, Cole. Take the money and live, or stand on principle and burn." Ethan's hand hung loose near the colt, his body relaxed but ready. He did the math quickly, 7 guns against 1, all of them with the advantage of mounted position and numbers. A fight here would end badly, probably for everyone. But surrender meant abandoning everything Margaret had fought for, everything Robert had died protecting. "Here's my counteroffer," Ethan said quietly. "You and your men ride out now. In 2 weeks, we'll settle this in court like civilized people. You might lose, you might win, but at least nobody burns." Voss laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You think you're still wearing a badge, lawman? You think justice means something out here?" He gestured to his men. "This is justice, power, control. Everything else is just pretty words for people too weak to take what they want. Maybe. But I've found that men who need 6 others to back their play usually aren't as strong as they think." Ethan shifted his weight slightly, reading the positions of each rider. "And I've found that men who threaten women and children tend to die badly, whether it's today or someday down the line." The words hit their mark. Voss's face darkened with fury. "You arrogant son of a... Boss! One of the riders cut him off, his voice urgent. "We got movement on the ridge." Everyone turned. Through the darkness, Ethan could make out figures on horseback silhouetted against the stars. Not many, maybe 4 or 5, but enough to change the odds significantly. As his eyes adjusted, he recognized the lead figure, Thomas Boone, sitting his old mare with a rifle across his saddle. "Evening, Clayton." Boone's voice carried clearly across the distance. "Seems like a lot of men for a friendly visit." "This is none of your concern, Thomas. Go home to your family." "Actually, it is my concern. Margaret Warren's my neighbor, and neighbors look out for each other." 3 more riders emerged from the shadows, men Ethan didn't recognize but who carried themselves with the quiet competence of people who knew their way around trouble. "Funny thing, Clayton. When word spreads that you're planning to burn out a widow and her child, folks start remembering their conscience. Start thinking maybe they should have stood up sooner." Voss's hands tightened on his reins. "You're making a mistake, Boone. All of you. When this is over, it'll be settled in court, legally. The way it should have been handled from the start." Boone's rifle stayed casual, but his meaning was clear. "Now you've got a choice. Ride out peaceful or start something you might not finish." For a long moment, the night balanced on a knife edge. Ethan could feel the tension, the proximity to violence like electricity in the air. Voss's men were hired guns, but they were also professionals who understood when odds had shifted beyond their pay grade. 7 guns was confidence. 7 guns against 5 men on high ground with rifles was suicide. Voss made his decision. "This isn't over, not by a long shot. You're just delaying the inevitable." He wheeled his horse around with unnecessary force. "Let's go." The riders retreated into the darkness, the sound of hoofbeats fading gradually until silence reclaimed the night. Only then did Boone and his companions ride down to the cabin, their postures easing as danger passed. Margaret emerged from the doorway, Lily clutched against her side, both of them pale but composed. "Thomas, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just let us help the way we should have been helping all along." Boone dismounted, introducing the other men. "This is Carl Morrison, James Webb, and Henry Fisher. All of us have been on the receiving end of Voss's pressure at one time or another. When I told them what he was planning tonight, they didn't hesitate." The men nodded their greetings, their weathered faces showing a mix of shame and determination. Carl Morrison spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "Mrs. Warren, I stood by when your husband died, and you needed help. I convinced myself it wasn't my business, that I had my own troubles to manage. But Thomas reminded me that evil only wins when good folks do nothing. So here we are, ready to do something, finally." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you all." "Thank us by winning that court case," Henry Fisher said. "By proving Voss can be beaten, that his threats don't have to rule our lives. You do that, and maybe the rest of us will find our spine again." They stayed for another hour posting watch rotations and making plans for the 2 weeks until the hearing. It was decided that at least 2 men would be on the property at all times, rotating through the neighbors who'd finally found their courage. Ethan would continue working the repairs, but now with backup and support. As the men prepared to leave, Boone pulled Ethan aside. "That was close tonight. If we'd been 5 minutes later—" "But you weren't. You were exactly where you needed to be." Ethan clasped the older man's shoulder. "Thank you. For coming. For standing. Should have done it months ago." Boone looked toward Margaret and Lily, standing in the cabin's golden light. "But better late than never, I suppose. Better to find courage eventually than never find it at all." After everyone left, Ethan did a final patrol of the property before heading to the barn. He found Margaret waiting for him at the barn door, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling night air. "You could have been killed tonight," she said without preamble. "Standing out there alone against all of them. But I wasn't. Turns out I wasn't as alone as it looked. Still," she crossed her arms, her expression fierce despite the tears on her cheeks. "You don't have a badge anymore, Ethan. You don't have to be the one standing between danger and innocent people. You've done enough. More than enough." "Have I?" He leaned against the barn wall, suddenly exhausted. "Because it doesn't feel like enough. Doesn't feel like nearly enough." What would be enough? The question hung in the darkness between them. Ethan thought about Catherine and Sarah, about arriving too late and losing everything despite his badge and authority and desperate efforts. He thought about the 3 years of drifting, trying to outrun the guilt of survival and the weight of responsibility he'd abandoned. "I don't know if anything's ever enough," he said quietly. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just showing up, standing where you're needed, doing what you can even if it's not everything." Margaret stepped closer, close enough that he could see the starlight reflected in her eyes. "You showed up. You stood. You did far more than anyone had a right to ask." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Your month is almost up. You fulfilled your obligation. No one would blame you for riding out now before things get worse." "Would you blame me?" "No. Never." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'd miss you. Lily would miss you. This place would feel emptier without you in it." The admission hung between them, fragile and honest. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, like a door he'd kept locked finally creaking open despite his best efforts to keep it sealed. "I'm not going anywhere," he heard himself say. "Not until this is finished. Not until you're safe and that little girl can sleep without fear." He paused, then added the truth beneath the practical words. "Maybe not even then." Margaret's breath caught. "Ethan, don't. Not yet." He straightened, needing the distance to think clearly. "Let's get through the hearing first. Let's make sure Voss can't hurt you anymore. Then we can talk about whatever this is." She nodded, understanding more than he'd said. 2 weeks. We hold on for 2 more weeks, and everything changes." 2 weeks, he agreed. She left him then, walking back to the cabin with her shoulders straight and her head high. Ethan watched her go, feeling the weight of promises spoken and unspoken, of choices that couldn't be unmade and futures that were starting to look more possible than they'd seemed in years. In the loft, he lay awake long into the night, listening to the sound of horses on distant patrol and the whisper of wind through pine. The badge Samuel Tucker had sent sat in his pocket, a reminder of what he'd been and what he'd walked away from. But maybe walking away had just been preparation for this moment, for standing his ground when it mattered, for people who mattered, in a place that was starting to feel dangerously close to home. 2 weeks until the hearing, 14 days to keep them safe, and then, well, then he'd figure out what came next. For now, for tonight, it was enough to know he'd made the right choice, to know he'd stayed. The 2 weeks that followed moved with the strange duality of time under pressure, each day crawling past with anxious slowness, while the final deadline rushed closer with terrifying speed. Ethan worked the property alongside the rotating guards, turning the Warren claim into something that looked less like desperation and more like defiance. The fence stood straight and true. The barn roof no longer leaked. The garden plot got turned and prepared for spring planting, even though none of them knew for certain they'd be here to see seeds sprout. Margaret grew stronger daily, her color returning and her movements losing the fragility that had marked her recovery. She spent hours reviewing documents with Samuel Tucker's letters, preparing her testimony with the focused intensity of someone who understood that everything depended on the next few days. Lily returned to her studies with renewed purpose, but Ethan noticed the way her eyes tracked every unfamiliar sound, the way she stayed close to the cabin whenever strangers approached. The neighbors maintained their vigil with quiet determination. Thomas Boone and his rotation of watchers became a constant presence, their rifles always visible, their commitment no longer in question. It was as if Voss's midnight threat had finally broken the dam of fear that had kept good people silent, and now that the water had started flowing, there was no stopping it. On the 5th day, a rider came from Helena, not Danny Tucker this time, but a court official carrying official documents. The emergency hearing had been scheduled for the following Monday at 10 in the morning. All parties were required to appear with their evidence and witnesses. The witness from Oregon had already arrived in Helena and was being housed under protection until the hearing. 3 of the other families Voss had defrauded were also coming forward, their testimonies ready to establish the pattern Samuel Tucker needed to prove systematic fraud. Margaret read the notice 3 times, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. It's real. It's actually happening. Were you worried it wouldn't? Ethan asked from where he stood by the window, watching the official ride away. I was worried about a lot of things. That Tucker would back out, that the witness would disappear, that Voss would find some way to delay or derail the whole process. She set the document down carefully, as if it might disintegrate if handled roughly. Now it's just a matter of getting there and telling the truth. Just, Ethan repeated with a slight smile, as if the next 4 days won't be the most dangerous we've faced yet. He was right to be concerned. That night, fire broke out in the dry grass behind the barn, small and contained, easily stomped out by the men on watch, but clearly deliberate. The next morning, they found 3 fence posts cut nearly through, weakened so they'd collapse under pressure, but not obviously sabotaged at first glance. The day after that, someone took shots at Carl Morrison while he rode patrol, bullets close enough to be threatening but not close enough to actually hit. Warning shots, designed to intimidate and terrify. Voss was escalating, but carefully, nothing overt enough to bring law enforcement down on him before the hearing, but enough to make clear that his earlier threats hadn't been empty. The message was obvious. Withdraw the case, or things would get worse. Margaret's response was to pack methodically for the journey to Helena, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination Ethan had first seen when she'd refused Voss's offer from her sickbed. He can burn every fence post and fire every shot he wants. I'm not backing down. Not now. Not when we're this close. The journey to Helena was planned with military precision. They'd leave Saturday morning, giving themselves a full day's cushion before Monday's hearing. Thomas Boone, Carl Morrison, and Henry Fisher would ride escort, all 3 men armed and alert. Danny Tucker would meet them halfway with additional men from Helena, creating a protected corridor for the final approach. Friday night arrived with the weight of anticipation and dread. Ethan did a final patrol of the property as the sun set, checking every corner, every vulnerable point. The land looked different now than it had 6 weeks ago when he'd first arrived. Cared for, tended, valued. The kind of place worth fighting for, worth the risk and complication and danger that came with standing your ground. He found Margaret in the cabin, going through Robert's papers one final time. Lily was already asleep, exhausted by the tension of the past weeks. In the lamplight, Margaret looked younger than her years, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to show. "You should get some rest," Ethan said quietly. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "I know, I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed anything, that every document is in order, every piece of evidence accounted for." She closed the leather case carefully. "Robert spent months building this case. He died believing it mattered. I need to make sure his work wasn't wasted." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her, straddling it. "It wasn't wasted. Win or lose Monday, what Robert did matters. He stood up to power when it would have been easier to surrender. He fought for his family's future even knowing the cost. That's not wasted, that's legacy. Legacy doesn't keep the land if we lose. No, but it keeps something more important. It teaches Lily that some things are worth fighting for, that integrity matters more than safety, that you don't surrender your dignity just because someone threatens you." He leaned forward. "Whatever happens Monday, you've already won the important battle. You've shown that little girl how to be strong." Margaret's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You've become very important to us, to Lily. To me." She paused, then pushed forward with characteristic directness. "What happens after Monday? After this is finished?" It was the question Ethan had been avoiding, the one that had no easy answer. He thought about the road stretching away from this place, about the familiar comfort of solitude and movement. Then he thought about Lily's laughter and Margaret's steady strength, and the way this broken claim had somehow started feeling like more than just another stop on an endless journey. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 3 years, I've been running from anything that looked like permanence, convinced myself that caring meant losing, that the safest way to live was to never stop long enough to build something worth protecting." He met her eyes. "But I've been here 6 weeks now, and I'm starting to think maybe I had it backwards. Maybe the running was the loss, and staying is what takes real courage." "So you'll stay? After the hearing?" "If you'll have me. Not as a drifter working for room and board, but as—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain how to name what he was offering. Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand in both of hers. "As family. As someone who belongs here, who has a stake in this place, and its future." Her voice was steady despite the emotion beneath it. I can't offer you much, Ethan. This claim is still struggling, still vulnerable, and I come with a daughter and debt and complications that would make most men run. But if you're willing to stay anyway, willing to build something here with us, then yes, I'll have you. We'll have you. The simplicity of the offer was devastating in its honesty. No promises of easy times or guaranteed outcomes, just the truth of what she had and what she was willing to share. Ethan felt something in his chest unknot completely, 3 years of grief and guilt finally beginning to ease. Then I'll stay, he said quietly. However this plays out Monday, I'll stay. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face with sudden joy. She stood, still holding his hand, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the scarred table. Two people broken by loss, rebuilt by necessity, and finding in each other the possibility of something whole. I should let you get some rest, Ethan said finally, though he made no move to leave. You should, Margaret agreed, also not moving. Then, with the same directness she brought to everything, she stepped around the table and kissed him. It was brief, tentative, carrying more question than answer. But when she pulled back, her eyes held steady on his. Just so you know what you're agreeing to, she said softly. I don't do anything halfway. Not fighting for this land, not raising my daughter, and not whatever this is between us. Ethan cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Good. Because halfway has never worked for me either. They stood close for another moment, breathing the same air, letting the weight of commitment settle between them. Then Margaret stepped back, practical even in tenderness. Now go get actual rest. Tomorrow we ride, and I need you alert and watching for trouble. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. They loaded the wagon with their supplies and documents. Margaret and Lily bundled against the chill, while Ethan and the 3 escorts checked weapons and provisions with grim efficiency. The mood was tense but determined, everyone understanding what was at stake. They made good time through the morning, the horses fresh and the trail dry. Thomas Boone rode point while Carl and Henry flanked the wagon, all of them scanning constantly for signs of ambush or trouble. But the miles passed quietly, almost anticlimactically, until they reached the halfway point where Danny Tucker waited with 4 additional riders. Any problems? Danny asked as they watered the horses. Too quiet, actually, Ethan replied, his instincts prickling with unease. I expected Voss to make another play before we got this far. Maybe he's counting on the hearing going his way. Maybe he's got the judge bought. Danny's young face was troubled. Pa's been getting reports that Voss has been meeting with Judge Morrison privately. Could be nothing, could be everything. Margaret overheard, and her expression tightened. Judge Morrison is the one hearing our case? Yes, ma'am. He's been the territorial judge for 10 years. Pa says he's generally honest, but everyone has their price, and Voss has deep pockets. Then we'll have to make our case so strong that honesty is the only option. Margaret climbed back onto the wagon seat. Let's keep moving. The sooner we get to Helena, the better. They reached the town by late afternoon, the territorial capital bustling with the commerce and activity of Montana's seat of government. Samuel Tucker met them personally, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who'd fought too many battles in courtrooms to be easily intimidated. Margaret, it's good to see you looking so much better than last time. Tucker shook her hand warmly, then turned to Ethan. And you must be Cole. Danny's told me about your help. I appreciate you standing with Margaret through this. Just doing what needs doing, Ethan replied. Tucker led them to a boarding house where he'd arranged rooms under assumed names, a precaution against any last-minute interference from Voss. As they settled in, he spread documents across the table in Margaret's room and walked them through the case one final time. The witness from Oregon is solid. Jacob Patterson held the original gambling debt that Voss claims gives him rights to challenge your ownership. Patterson will testify that the debt was settled in full in 1852, 15 years ago. He has the receipt of payment signed by the debtor, proving the obligation was satisfied long before Robert purchased the land. Tucker tapped another stack of papers. These are the testimonies from the 3 other families Voss defrauded using similar tactics, establishing pattern and intent. What's our weakest point? Margaret asked. Judge Morrison. He's not corrupt exactly, but he's cautious, doesn't like making waves or challenging powerful men without ironclad evidence. Voss will play on that caution, try to create enough doubt to make Morrison hesitate. Tucker looked at her seriously. Your testimony will be crucial. You'll need to be clear, composed, and absolutely certain. Any hesitation, any uncertainty, and Morrison will seize on it as reason to delay or dismiss. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. I can do that. I've lived this nightmare for months. I know every detail of Robert's case, every piece of evidence. I won't falter. Sunday passed in tense preparation. Tucker drilled Margaret on potential questions, helped her organize her thoughts and testimony. Ethan kept watch, his presence a steady anchor as the hours crawled toward Monday morning. Lily stayed close to her mother, her young face solemn with understanding that tomorrow would determine everything. That night, Ethan found Margaret standing at the window of her room, looking out at the darkened streets of Helena. She didn't turn when he entered, just continued staring into the darkness. I keep thinking about Robert, she said quietly, about how hard he fought, how certain he was that truth and law would protect us. And then I think about how he died before seeing any of it matter, before knowing if his work would be enough. She wrapped her arms around herself. What if it's not enough, Ethan? What if we lose tomorrow despite everything? He moved behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. Then we figure out the next step. Appeal, if Tucker thinks we have grounds. Move if we have to, start over somewhere Voss's reach doesn't extend. But we'll do it together, all three of us. You won't face it alone. She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I'm scared. Not for myself. I've survived worse than losing land, but for Lily, for the promise I made Robert, for the idea that men like Voss can just take what they want because they have more power and money. They can't. Not always. Not when good people stand up and fight back. Ethan turned her gently to face him. Look at what's already changed. 6 weeks ago, you were isolated, dying, with no one willing to help. Now you've got neighbors who found their courage, a lawyer who believes in your case, witnesses willing to testify. That's not nothing, Margaret. That's proof that resistance matters. She searched his face, then nodded slowly. You're right. Whatever happens tomorrow, we've already proven that Voss doesn't get to win by default. That has to count for something. Monday morning arrived with autumn sunshine and cold air that burned in the lungs. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors from Redemption Springs who'd made the journey, townspeople drawn by the spectacle of someone challenging Clayton Voss, and reporters from 2 territorial newspapers sensing a story worth covering. Voss sat at his table with 3 expensive lawyers, his expression confident and faintly amused, like a man watching children play at being adults. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 10, a lean man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that gave nothing away. He took his seat, surveyed the packed courtroom, and called the proceedings to order. Samuel Tucker opened with a clear, methodical presentation of the case. The land was purchased legally by Robert Warren in 1864. The deed was recorded properly. The claim had been worked and improved consistently. The gambling debt that Voss claimed gave him rights to challenge ownership had been satisfied in full 15 years prior to the Warren purchase, making it irrelevant to current ownership questions. Furthermore, Your Honor, Tucker continued, his voice carrying clearly, we will demonstrate that Mr. Voss has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, using fabricated debts and legal intimidation to force families off their land. The Warren case is not an isolated incident, but part of a calculated campaign of theft dressed up in legal language. Voss's lead attorney stood smoothly, his expensive suit and cultured voice designed to project authority and respectability. Your Honor, these are serious accusations against a pillar of the community. Mr. Voss has done nothing but exercise his legitimate legal rights in a property dispute. Mrs. Warren, tragic as her circumstances may be, is simply a woman who doesn't understand the complexities of territorial law and land ownership. The casual dismissal made Margaret's jaw tighten, but she stayed composed as Tucker had instructed. They'd expected this approach, painting her as an emotional, confused widow who'd misunderstood legitimate business as persecution. The witness testimony began with Jacob Patterson, the Oregon creditor. He was a weathered man in his 70s who spoke with the slow precision of someone who'd thought carefully about every word. Yes, he'd held a gambling debt from a man named Marcus Fletcher. Yes, the debt had been settled in full in 1852 for the sum of $200. Yes, he had the receipt of payment, signed and dated. No, there was no outstanding obligation that could transfer to the Fletcher property. Voss's attorneys attacked hard, trying to discredit Patterson's memory, his records, his motives. But the old man held steady, producing documents that had been notarized and witnessed, his testimony unshakable. The three other families followed, each telling similar stories of Voss using fabricated debts or legal technicalities to pressure them into selling land at a fraction of its value. Two had surrendered and moved away, carrying the bitterness of defeat. One had fought back and won, but only after years of legal battles that had cost them everything but the land itself. By midday, the pattern was undeniable. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from neutral to troubled, his questions becoming sharper and more pointed when directed at Voss's attorneys. Then it was Margaret's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, wearing her best dress, still worn and mended in places, but clean and respectable. She swore her oath and met Tucker's eyes steadily as he began his questions. "Mrs. Warren, please tell the court about your late husband's purchase of the property in question." Margaret's voice was clear and firm. Robert Warren purchased 40 acres in Redemption Springs territory in May 1864 from a land speculator named James Hartley. He paid $300, every cent we'd saved since arriving in Montana. The deed was recorded with the territorial office, and we took possession immediately. My husband worked that land for 3 years, building our home, establishing timber contracts, creating something for our family. And when did Mr. Voss first make his claim on the property? 6 months after my husband's death. He came to our home offering condolences and suggesting I sell to him. When I refused, he filed legal papers claiming a debt against the previous owner gave him rights to challenge our ownership. Margaret's hands were steady in her lap. But my husband had investigated thoroughly before purchasing. He knew about the old gambling debt and confirmed it had been satisfied. He kept copies of everything: the original deed, correspondence with Mr. Patterson, statements from witnesses. He was a careful man, Your Honor. He didn't leave things to chance. Tucker walked her through each document, each piece of evidence Robert had compiled. Margaret's testimony was detailed without being emotional, factual without being cold. She spoke of her husband's work with pride, but also with the grounded reality of someone who understood that sentiment wouldn't win cases. Only truth and evidence mattered. When Voss's attorneys began their cross-examination, they tried the expected tactics, questioned whether a widow could really understand the complexities of her husband's business, suggested that grief had clouded her judgment, implied that accepting Voss's generous offer would be the wise, practical choice for a woman with a young daughter to protect. Margaret met each insinuation with calm refutation. My husband discussed every aspect of the land purchase and legal situation with me. I wasn't simply his wife, I was his partner in building our homestead. I understand completely what's at stake here, and I understand that Mr. Voss is attempting to steal what my husband died defending. Strong words, Mrs. Warren, the attorney said with oily condescension. Perhaps emotional rather than factual? No, sir, factual. Mr. Voss has fabricated a legal claim to property he has no legitimate right to. He's used intimidation and isolation to try to force me into surrender. When that didn't work, he made threats against my home and family. Those aren't emotions. Those are facts that multiple witnesses can corroborate. The attorney tried several more angles, but Margaret didn't waver. She'd lived this nightmare too long, fought too hard, to be shaken by legal maneuvering now. When she finally stepped down, Ethan saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the fierce satisfaction of someone who'd spoken truth to power and refused to be diminished. Tucker called his final witness, Thomas Boone, who testified to the community pressure Voss had exerted, the fear that had kept neighbors from helping Margaret, and finally the threats Voss had made during his midnight visit to the Warren property. Boone's voice carried shame for his earlier inaction, but also determination to make things right. Finally, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Tucker was brief and devastating, summarizing the mountain of evidence that proved Voss's claim was fraudulent and his methods criminal. Voss's attorneys argued that land law was complex, that their client had acted in good faith based on information available to him, that emotional sympathy for a widow shouldn't override legitimate legal questions. Morrison called a 1-hour recess to review the evidence and prepare his ruling. The courtroom emptied slowly, people stretching and talking in hushed voices. Margaret stood with Ethan and Lily in a quiet corner, her face pale but composed. "How do you think it went?" she asked Tucker quietly. "I think we presented a strong case. Morrison looked troubled by the pattern evidence. That's good for us. But he's also cautious, and Voss has influence." Tucker's expression was guardedly optimistic. "It could go either way. But I believe we've given Morrison enough evidence that ruling for Voss would be indefensible. The question is whether Morrison has the courage to do what's right when it means challenging the most powerful man in the territory." The hour crawled past with agonizing slowness. When the bailiff finally called them back, the courtroom packed even tighter than before, word having spread that a ruling was imminent. Ethan positioned himself where he could see both Margaret and Voss, his instincts prickling with the awareness that however this went, there would be consequences. Judge Morrison entered and took his seat, his expression grave. He shuffled papers for a moment, then looked up at the assembled crowd. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in the case of Voss versus Warren. This is a matter that goes beyond simple property dispute. It touches on fundamental questions of law, justice, and the integrity of our territorial legal system." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Margaret's hand found Ethan's, gripping tight. The evidence presented by Mrs. Warren and her counsel is extensive and compelling. Multiple witnesses, including the original creditor, Mr. Patterson, have testified under oath that the gambling debt claimed by Mr. Voss was satisfied in full in 1852. Documentary evidence supports this testimony. Furthermore, the pattern evidence showing similar tactics employed by Mr. Voss against other families raises serious questions about the good faith of his claim. Voss's expression was darkening, his attorneys shifting uncomfortably. In contrast, Mr. Voss has provided no credible documentation supporting his claim to the debt in question. His case rests entirely on assertion and legal technicality, without substantive proof. Morrison's voice hardened. "This court will not allow legal process to be weaponized against honest settlers who've worked and improved their land in good faith." Margaret's grip on Ethan's hand tightened painfully. "Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendant, Margaret Warren. The Voss claim is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation into possible fraud and criminal intimidation. The Warren property ownership is confirmed as legitimate and incontestable." Morrison brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "This case is closed." The courtroom erupted. Neighbors from Redemption Springs cheered. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, as if unable to process what she'd heard. Then she turned to Ethan with tears streaming down her face. "We won. We actually won." Lily launched herself at her mother, both of them crying and laughing at once. Tucker was grinning broadly, already gathering documents. Thomas Boone and the others pushed through the crowd to offer congratulations and support. But Ethan was watching Voss. The man's face had gone from confident to furious in the span of seconds, his carefully maintained mask cracking to show the rage beneath. He stood abruptly, shoving past his attorneys, and for a moment his eyes locked with Ethan's across the courtroom. The look carried pure hatred and unspoken promises of retribution. Then Voss was gone, disappearing into the crowd with his lawyers trailing behind. Ethan filed the moment away. The battle was won, but he wasn't naive enough to think the war was over. Men like Voss didn't accept defeat gracefully. They adapted, regrouped, and came back harder. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, watching Margaret and Lily holding each other and crying with relief and joy, seeing the neighbors who'd found their courage celebrating a victory that belonged to all of them, Ethan let himself feel the simple satisfaction of a fight won honestly. The journey back to Redemption Springs took 2 days, slowed by celebration stops at every homestead where supporters wanted to congratulate Margaret and hear about the trial firsthand. Word spread fast. Voss had been defeated, the powerful brought low by truth and courage, and suddenly resistance felt possible in a way it hadn't before. When they finally reached the Warren property, the sun was setting in brilliant colors across the Montana sky. The cabin looked different somehow, not physically changed, but transformed by the knowledge that it was truly theirs, secure and uncontestable. Margaret stood in the yard, turning slowly to take it all in, tears streaming down her face again. "Robert," she whispered, "we did it. Your daughter's inheritance is safe. Your dream survived." Lily pressed close to her mother's side, and Ethan gave them space for their private moment of grief and triumph mixed together. He walked to the fence line he'd repaired weeks ago, looking out at land that had become familiar, important, worth defending. Behind him, he heard footsteps, Margaret approaching alone, Lily having gone inside. She stopped beside him, both of them looking at the sunset. "Thank you," she said simply. "For stopping when Lily asked. For staying when you could have left. For standing with us when it got dangerous. We couldn't have won this without you. You would have found a way. You're too stubborn to lose." "Maybe. But I'm grateful I didn't have to find out." She turned to face him. "Your month is long past. Actually, you've been here almost 7 weeks now. Still planning to stay?" Ethan looked at her. This woman who'd fought fever and fear and a powerful enemy without breaking, who'd found strength in the middle of grief, who'd taught her daughter and everyone watching that some things were worth fighting for. He thought about the road and the solitude that had once felt like safety. And he thought about the way this place had somehow stopped being just another stop and started being something more. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm planning to stay, if the offer's still open." "It is. It absolutely is." Margaret smiled, the expression bright enough to rival the sunset. "Though I should warn you, there's still a lot of work to do. The barn needs a complete rebuild, the irrigation system is a disaster, and we'll need to think about livestock come spring. Plus, Lily needs proper schooling, which means either bringing in a teacher or one of us teaching her ourselves." "Sounds like you're trying to scare me off." "I'm trying to be honest about what you're agreeing to. Life here won't be easy, even with the legal threat gone. Montana winters are brutal. Money will be tight for years. And you'll be taking on not just a struggling claim, but a ready-made family with all the complications that brings." Ethan reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Margaret, for 3 years I've been running from exactly this, from commitment and permanence and the risk of losing something that matters. And you know what I learned? Running doesn't make you safe. It just makes you empty." He pulled her closer. "I'd rather face hard winters and tight money and complications with you and Lily than spend another day drifting alone." She kissed him then, properly this time, with none of the tentative questioning of their first kiss. This was certainty and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had thought they'd find again. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "We should probably tell Lily," Margaret said. "She's been making plans for where you should sleep once you're not just a hired hand anymore." "Has she now?" "Apparently the barn loft is unacceptable for family. She's very firm on that point." Margaret laughed. "Fair warning, you're about to gain a very opinionated 8-year-old daughter along with everything else." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand as full dark settled over the land. Through the window, they could see Lily lighting lamps, her small figure moving with the confidence of a child who finally felt safe in her own home. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not the absence of grief for what he'd lost, but the presence of something new growing alongside the old scars. Inside, Lily looked up as they entered, her eyes immediately going to their joined hands. A grin split her face. "Does this mean Ethan's staying forever?" "That's exactly what it means," Margaret confirmed. Lily launched herself at Ethan with a whoop of joy, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I knew it. I told Mama you would. I told her when you first stopped that you were different, that you'd stay if we just gave you reason to." Ethan ruffled her hair, his throat tight with emotion. "You gave me plenty of reasons. You and your mama both." They spent the evening making plans, practical things like winter supplies and spring planting, but also dreams like expanding the cabin and maybe running a few head of cattle once they'd built up capital. Lily contributed her own ideas, including a library room because every proper home needs books, and a better barn for the horses she was certain they'd eventually acquire. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep and Margaret was preparing for bed, Ethan stepped outside one final time. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the darkness. He pulled out the badge Samuel Tucker had sent, looking at it in the starlight. For years, this piece of tin had represented everything he'd failed to protect, everyone he'd lost despite his authority and best efforts. But maybe Tucker had been right in a different way than intended. Maybe being the person who stood between innocent people and harm didn't require official authority. Maybe it just required the choice to stand, day after day, regardless of personal cost. He tucked the badge back in his pocket, not something he needed to wear, but something worth keeping. A reminder that protecting what mattered didn't require perfection, just persistence. Just showing up and doing the work, and refusing to abandon people who needed help. A year later, on a warm spring morning, Ethan stood in the rebuilt barn, solid construction this time, built to last generations, and watched as Lily led a new foal on uncertain legs out into the sunshine. The Warren claim had transformed over the months. The cabin had gained 2 additional rooms. The fence enclosed not just 40 acres but 60, after they'd purchased adjacent land from a neighbor looking to move on. A dozen head of cattle grazed in the lower meadow, and Margaret's garden was already showing green shoots promising a good harvest. The legal aftermath of the trial had been satisfying. The territorial attorney general had indeed investigated Voss, finding enough evidence of fraud to bring criminal charges. Voss had fled to California before trial, his empire crumbling as families he'd cheated found courage to come forward. The land he'd stolen piece by piece was being returned to rightful owners, his legacy transformed from power to cautionary tale. Thomas Boone and the other neighbors had become more than allies. They were community, watching out for each other, helping with harvests and barn raisings and the 1,000 small necessities of frontier life. The isolation that had nearly killed Margaret was replaced by genuine connection, the kind of mutual support that made hard lives bearable. Margaret emerged from the cabin, her figure noticeably rounded with the child she carried. They'd married quietly last fall, just family and close friends present, the ceremony simple but meaningful. Now they were building something neither had expected to find again, a partnership grounded in mutual respect and hard-won trust, growing into something deeper with each passing day. She came to stand beside Ethan, her hand finding his automatically. Lily's doing well with the foal. She's got her father's way with animals. She's got her mother's stubbornness, which is more useful, Ethan replied with a smile. True enough. Margaret leaned against him, comfortable in the easy intimacy they'd developed. I was thinking, when the baby comes, we should name him Robert if it's a boy, after his grandfather. And if it's a girl? Catherine, after someone who meant everything to you. Margaret looked up at him. They're both part of our story, Ethan. The people we lost and the love we had for them. Naming our children after them isn't forgetting. It's remembering that love doesn't end just because life does. Ethan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. Robert or Catherine it is. They stood together watching Lily work with the foal, watching their land green and grow, watching the future take shape from the ruins of their separate pasts. It wasn't the life either of them had planned or expected, but it was real and solid and built on a foundation strong enough to weather whatever Montana threw at them. Because they'd learned the most important lesson, that choosing to stay, choosing to build, choosing to open yourself to connection despite the risk of loss, that was where life actually happened. Everything else was just running, and Ethan Cole was done running. He was home,